Hello, and welcome to Second Best University, a reading companion podcast for Dungeons & Dragons. I'm Steven, and I'll be your book club buddy. Let's get into it. Previously, on a very special episode of I'm just kidding, I got you, it's Second Best You! Welcome back! Hey, the second episode! We have a bunch to cover this time, but before we dive in, I wanted to thank everybody who wrote to secondbestdnd@gmail with SBU in the headline, asking rules questions. It was really fun answering them. You asked really good questions. It was awesome, so keep it up. If you have questions, or even if it's just like pops into your head, please send us an email. It's fun for me. And thank you all of you who followed us on Twitter and have liked and retweeted and done all the Twitter stuff to us. Our Twitter is @SecondBestU. I tweeted out a question wondering what you all wanted to know about D&D right now, because that's what I want to give you. And I got a response that really interested me from a second bestie whose Twitter handle was, oh my god, I'm going to butcher this, Glyquen? I'm going to spell it. GLYWQEN Glyquen. So Glyquen asked, how do you keep players engaged in virtual games? They are playing on Discord a lot, and they're wondering how to keep people focused or having fun. And I gotta say, this is top of mind for me. Second Best has been doing Rogues Gallery, which we've done twice now. And the first time, we had fun. It was a good time. But the first time for me felt like, I don't know why did that not feel like we were sitting at a table? What can I do? And the second time, it felt way more fun, way more like a regular Second Best game. I had a blast. So I'm going to tell you what I changed between time 1 and time 2, because maybe that'll help you. The big realization I had is that the first time I was focused a lot more on the game than on the players, which I'm usually not like that in person, so I tried to change virtually to be like that. The first time we played, I was mostly looking at the map and had a bunch of tools open about the various weapons that each character had and their character sheets and some strategies I had for monsters. And the second time, I had the map much smaller than the players' faces, and I had all of those tools. I basically tried to research as much as I could beforehand, and then I went in with what I knew and hoped for the best. So I really strongly recommend that you run a game and not a meeting. A lot of the tools that we have that are available for socializing right now are really meeting tools that we're sort of like using to socialize. So don't fall into the meeting trap. Let people talk on the side like they would if they were in person. Let them have the weird conversations in the chat that they would usually have at the table. It's totally fine if every second of the game is not somebody talking in character. It's fun to hang out with your friends, and that should come first. And if that comes first, and when that comes first, the game is more fun and people are more engaged. They show up because they're relaxed, they're hanging out, and then they want to play D&D. So that would be my big advice. You want to focus more on the players than on the tools, and you want to make sure that the tools are focused on the game and not on the meeting aspect of people socializing. But thank you so much. That was a really great question. Okay, like I said, we have a ton of information to get to. Right now, we're reading the basic rules. Last time we read the introduction, and the only things you really need to know from that episode to understand this episode is that the basic loop of Dungeons & Dragons is describe, decide, determine. The DM describes a situation, the players decide what they want to do, and then they use the rules to determine what happens next. The other thing is that D&D is a storytelling medium. This time, we're going to be reading the basic rules, Chapter 7. Using ability scores. It's a big topic, and it's only on pages 60 to 65. So it's a short read. So if you're going to read, then go ahead and read pages 60 to 65 of the basic rules now. And if you're not, then enjoy some pleasant music, and we will be back at the 6-minute mark. Hey, welcome back. All right, let's get into the reading that we had this time. So, first, the fundamentals. Why would you ever use an ability score? What are they? Well, the ability scores are strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. There's no quiz. They're on every character sheet. You'll see them all the time. It's the 6 biggest numbers, basically. When would we use them? Let's go over a little role-playing example. Let's do a little role-playing on this role-playing podcast, and I'll show you when you would do it. So, if I was the DM, and I described that you're out, you're swaggering around, you're walking down the street, and you see a cool car, and you're a player, and you decide, hey, wow, that's a cool car. You know what I do with cool cars? I lift them. What a cool character choice. So you've decided you want to lift that car. Now, you and I might have different ideas about how possible this is. Like, if I was telling a story about me, Stephen Buckley, wanting to lift a car, that story is going to end with me straight up not lifting that car. But if you wanted to tell a story about your awesome Superman character lifting a car, then of course you should lift a car. So we would have a disagreement about whether or not this character can lift this car. That's when the determine step, so I've described, you've decided, and now we need to determine, can this person lift this car? That's where the strength check comes into play. We need to check if you have the strength to lift it. So a check is pretty much like the most common type of roll in Dungeons & Dragons, and it measures a test of an ability. So each ability that I listed above has a score between 3 and 20, and bigger is better. The higher your strength score is, the more strong you are. A perfectly average person has a 10 in all of their scores. And each ability also has a modifier, which is based on the score. So like a score of 10 has a modifier of 0. And every time the score goes up by 2, the modifier goes up by 1. So a score of 12 has a modifier of +1. A score of 14 has a modifier of +2. A score of 8 has a modifier of -1. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, so we've got these scores, we've got modifiers that are based on the scores. How do we check if you can lift this car? Well, first we decide what ability would help you lift a car. Strength makes the most sense to me. Then the DM, me, would privately determine how hard they think this is. I would say pretty hard, so I would set the difficulty class to a 20, which I would keep private to myself. We'll get more into how to set those later. Then you, the player, would roll a d20 and add your strength modifier, since that's the ability we're testing. If your total is higher than the difficulty class, then you succeed and you lift the car. And if your total is less than the difficulty class, then you fail and you don't lift the car. So if you rolled a 15 and you were Superman and you had +5 strength, then wow, holy cow, you lift the car no problem, because you tie with my 20, and that means you get to do it. If you were Stephen Buckley and your strength is, I'm going to say, a -2 modifier, then if you rolled a 15, you get a 13, and probably you hurt yourself trying to lift this car because you rolled a nat 1. That's the fun of D&D, is when you go to do a check, you're not really sure which way the story is going to go. What we just talked about, is called a raw ability check. And it's honestly fairly rare. I know I said earlier these are the most common kinds of checks, so what the heck? Why am I lying to you? Raw ability checks are really rare, but skill checks are really, really, really common. Skills are more specific uses of an ability in which you might have like special training or like just a natural proclivity. And that special training or proclivity is called proficiency. If you have proficiency with a skill, then when you make a check with that skill, you add the ability modifier, like we did with the strength modifier, but you also add your proficiency bonus. Proficiency bonus is something every character and every monster in Dungeons & Dragons has. It goes up with your level, and basically it's just like a how good you are at stuff number. You don't have to worry too much about it now. Finally, so that's skill checks. Skill checks are just ability checks that you get to put your proficiency bonus on if you're proficient in them. We will get into a bunch of examples of these later. The other thing that this chapter covers is saving throws. Saving throws are like skills in that you can be proficient in them and they add an ability modifier. But the biggest difference is that a saving throw only happens after you've experienced some sort of harmful effect. So if you succeed, you reduce the consequences of that effect, and if you fail, then you get the full consequences of the effect. They are way rarer than skills and attacks, And since there's non-voluntary, like the DM will tell you when you have to make a saving throw, there's not like much strategy to them. Like you want to make the saves when you can, but you can't really build a character around how cool their saving throws are. So I'm not going to spend too much time on saving throws, but there is a paragraph and a half at the end of this chapter about them if you want to read about them in more detail. Basically, there's one for every ability. You can be proficient in them. We did it! So now I want to get into some thoughts I have about how skills and abilities should be treated regardless of what that skill and ability is. So these are things that apply to all skills. Earlier, when we talked about that example with the car, I said that I thought that something was pretty hard, so I'd give it a 20 difficulty class, or what we call a DC 20 check. Setting a DC is the Dungeon Master's responsibility, and it is arguably the hardest part of learning to be a great Dungeon Master. Besides, being a master storyteller and figuring out how to stay the handsomest person you know, and also being so generous and kind. But really, seriously, the hardest part of dungeon mastering is difficulty classes. Setting DCs is really important because the skill checks that your players try to make determine what they can do in the world. So difficulty classes very really set the boundaries on what's possible for each of your players. Players that trust and understand the difficulty classes that they're dealing with will trust and understand the world and be able to navigate it intuitively. They'll have a sense for how stealthy their character is, or if they're able to make a large jump. Players that are more hesitant about these kind of things might feel like the difficulty classes are more arbitrary. The biggest warning sign at any table is when the DM asks for a check, the player rolls that check and tells the DM what they got, and then the DM hems and haws about whether or not that's a success. People who have never played before and people who are veterans all recognize this red flag subconsciously, because the second that happens, what the DM has essentially told every player is, your ability to do what you want in this game is dependent on my arbitrary decision making. That's not world exploring, that's not immersive storytelling, that's just having one friend who wants to say who's right and who's wrong, and have their sort of like fickle decision be whether or not their friends are good or bad at the game. If you want to tell a story, this is the kiss of death, and you should avoid that moment at all costs. And don't worry, I'm not just going to say, avoid this, and not give you any advice. I must preach to you from the gospel of consistent DCs, or consistent difficulty classes. This is a trick that I picked up from a dungeon master who I greatly respect called Dan Collins. You can find him at Wandering DMs. He's Dan Delta Collins. He is one of the smartest DMs I know. And one time I was playing in one of his games, and early on he told everybody that basically the way to know if they'd succeed is if they got higher than a particular number when they rolled a check, they succeeded, and otherwise they failed. And he would let them know if there was any deviation from that. And it changes the game so much to know what the default difficulty class for a skill check is. Consistent DCs let the players really feel progress. Like, you feel like, oh, I leveled up, I got +2 to this skill, wow, I'm going to succeed so much more often. You can plan around it. And then, like, they take pressure off of the DM. There was never a moment where Dan didn't know if somebody succeeded or failed in that game, because if it was above the number he said, then it succeeded, and if it was below it, it failed. In fact, it was so good, it got to the point where people would roll, and then we would all see it, and we would see the result of the roll, and we would all groan or cheer based on the roll, because we didn't have to worry about what Dan would say, because we knew, just like in real life, whether they succeeded or failed. And when your players do that, then you are really telling a story with the players. It sort of removes that weird arbitration aspect of being a dungeon master and lets you cheer them on or commiserate with them when the dice doesn't go their way. And it lets your players trust in you, the DM, more, because even though, yeah, you are still the one who says when there's a check and what the monsters are, and you're planning all the bad things that happen to them, you are now not the one who says, no, you know what? You can't lift the car. No, you know what? You don't make that jump. The world is real, and they feel like they can engage with it to solve their problems. It's so, so huge. Have consistent DCs. Stephen, what DCs should I have? I'm so glad you asked, other Stephen. Thank you for joining me in this recording booth. No problem, Other Steven. Answer the question. So at my tables, what I've started to do is say for 5th edition, this will change edition to edition and game to game, but for 5th edition D&D, 15 is what I say for most checks. If something's hard, like difficult for a hero, it should just be a 15. I sometimes do DC 10 checks if I think something isn't difficult, but if it goes wrong, there are big consequences. A recent example that came up in a game I'm playing, or I'm DMing in, is people were running across an ice bridge. It's not the hardest thing for them to do. It was a wide bridge, but if they slipped and fell, they were now falling off of a bridge. So that's, you want to know, even if it's unlikely if someone fails. And other examples would be like, if you are tossing a package from one ship to another as they pass. Or if you're trying to keep your horse quiet as the hellhounds perk their ears up looking for you. Like, that's a cool dramatic moment that probably will go your way if you're good with your horse, but if it doesn't, chase scene. So that's what I use 10s for. 15s are the default. 20 is for hard checks. Things that would be in the trailer if your like adventure was a movie. These aren't like campaign-defining moments. These are just moments that will stand out for this session. So like the jump to catch the traitor as they try to leave the room, those kind of things. I would make 20s. 25s are things that I would say are just barely this side of possible. Like barely not impossible. So examples of that are things where like a player comes up with an idea that's so heinous and stupid, but is so like it should not happen, but if it did happen, it would be so cool. That's gotta be a 25 because you gotta see if they can pull it off. It's just fun to live like that. I would say most successful books and movies have at least one moment in them when a 25 comes up and the player succeeds at it. You'll probably notice these if you look for them in stories. Another benefit of this is that there's another way to use skill checks, which is contests. Contests are when two sentient beings are trying to oppose each other's goals. For instance, the most common example is if I'm being stealthy and you're trying to see me, then I would make a stealth check and you would contest it with your perception check. So that's a fun way for us to sort of like play cat and mouse. If you have consistent DCs, then these contests will feel that much more exciting because they are the one thing your players can't plan around. Other people become real and alive because they aren't just a mechanical 15, 20, 10. They are 1d20 plus 6 or 1d20 plus 3. We just don't know. It makes it way more exciting, I gotta tell you. Okay, the next overarching thought is about passive and active skills. If you are new to D&D, you probably have no idea what I'm talking about. All of the things we've said so far are active skill checks. They are things that happen because you say, I want to do this, and then it happens. There are also some times when you need to do passive skill checks. Again, the most common example is stealth and perception. If I'm being sneaky and I'm sneaking around, sure, I'm actively sneaking, but someone could see me who's not trying to look for me. That's like what a guard is always doing. So passive perception is the most common type of passive skill check. It is just 10 plus whatever modifiers you would usually add to your roll. So it's as though you rolled a 10, the average. It's also useful when an action has no time limit. For instance, if you put a player in an NPC's study and they were trying to find a document, if they have 1 minute before the detective comes back, then they should make an investigation check and they should hurry through it and try to find it and hope for the best. But if they have all day in that study before the detective comes back, then they should take a passive check and get whatever they would get because on average, they're just going to do averagely. So, another overarching thought I want to touch on is working together and group checks. I don't really have a big thought about this. It's a rule that is in the rulebook that I completely forgot about if I ever knew it at all. And it's so great. I love it so much that I had to share it with everybody. So, group checks are really simple. If the whole party is going to perform an action like sneaking around or climbing a wall, then you make a group check, which is everyone in the party makes the check individually, but the group succeeds if the majority of the people in the group succeed. The idea of it is that the more talented people are compensating for the less talented people and kind of helping their teammates out. And I really love it because it makes the whole group a team instead of like a bunch of people who are acting on their own who succeed or fail by themselves. It takes them out of their swim lanes and puts them together, and it's so wonderful. I really, really like it. My final overarching thought is with skills with different abilities. There is a variant rule listed in Chapter 7 of using a skill with an ability that's not the ability it's paired with. What am I talking about? So all the abilities, strength, dexterity, intelligence, etc., they all have abilities that are associated with them. For instance, strength has athletics that's associated with it. The variant rule is basically saying you can take the skill of being proficient in athletics and apply it to other abilities if the context is correct. So if I was trying to swim very quickly to reach somebody, that's a strength athletics check because I'm just powering my way through. But if I'm trying to swim across, say, the English Channel, and it's going to take me 12 hours, that's maybe more about how much I can preserve the state of my body, how much I can, like, keep myself warm and keep myself breathing for that long. I don't know. I don't swim these distances. But it's more of a constitution athletics check. So then you could switch the ability by rolling a d20, adding whatever ability modifier is appropriate, and then adding your proficiency bonus if you're proficient with that skill. So I think, for my money, this variant is the only way that these skills make sense in this system. The way that I look at it is that abilities are the way you're trying to achieve your goal, and skills are the goal you're trying to achieve. So in the example that I just gave, you're trying to do an athletic thing in both cases. Swim, that's the goal. And you are trying to use an ability in each case it's going to be different. You're trying to use a bunch of power to get there faster, strength, or you're trying to use a lot of endurance to maintain yourself, constitution. So that's sort of an example of how you could use it. Also, I stole that example from the reading. So if you did the reading, then you know I just took that. That's for you. Ding. All right. Finally, I am done rattling on about my overarching thoughts, and we can dive into the specifics of each ability, talk about their skills, what you're here for. We're going to start with strength. It's pretty much the most understandable ability of all time, but to really express what it is, strength is the physical force that a character can produce. Punching, jumping, anything where force is leaving your body, and what's important is the amount of force. That's strength, baby. Now, strength is not something that has a lot of skills associated with it, but the only skill that's important is athletics. Most strength checks boil down to athletics because most people want to use their proficiency bonus when they're making a check. Now, I do want to put in a quick note here. Strength is strongly linked to intimidation. And remember that variant rule that I just talked about where you can use different abilities with the same skill? Intimidation is one that I think you should really consider basically a strength skill. I have some So, intimidation, the skill, is basically scaring someone into doing what you want. Now, strength intimidation would be like slamming someone against a wall or telling them what you want and then crushing a can, or even something as simple as like walking towards someone and punching your palm is a strength intimidation check because what you're trying to impose on them is that you can produce a lot of physical force. And wouldn't it suck if that happened to their body? And I don't think this isn't just me making this up either, by the way. Every class which depends on strength comes with intimidation proficiency. So I'm talking about the barbarian, the fighter, and the paladin. All of them need strength to succeed. Granted, the fighter can also do dexterity, but like, come on, who are we kidding? And all of them have optional intimidation proficiency in their class skills. We'll get more into classes later, so if you have no idea what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. But basically what I'm trying to say is strong characters tend to have the option of being intimidating because intimidation is arguably more of a strength skill than a charisma skill. Now, there are other ways to intimidate someone into doing what you want, right? Like, I would say that blackmail is a logical way to scare someone into doing what you want, so I would say that that's actually intelligent intimidation. There is also charisma intimidation, which I'll get to later, but just want to open your mind up to, I think strength also has the intimidation skill. There's also a lot of combat rules associated with strength. I'm going to get into those in the combat chapter because It's way easier to keep all that in one place and then focus on the skills right now. So if you hear me skip over like a lot of combat-y stuff, that's why. Now we're talking about dexterity. Dexterity is having precise control of your body. The skills that come with it are like acrobatics, sleight of hand, and stealth. And it's fairly easy to see why all of these, you need to be careful how you do them. Like acrobatics, the definition of acrobatics is basically having precise control over your body. Sleight of hand is precisely using your hand to deftly remove something without someone noticing, or move something without someone noticing. And stealth, if you don't think stealth is about precise control, I urge you to walk around on wooden floors at night without making a creak. That's what stealth should be. One thing that really stands out to me in the dexterity section is that they say that an example of dexterity is playing a stringed instrument. What? Shouldn't that be performance, which is under the charisma ability? Checkmate, rules lawyers. I'll see you in rules court where I will rules school your butts. No. I wanted to bring this up because it's a good example of something. So charisma performance, like charisma is when you're using social means to achieve your goal. We'll get into it in a little bit. I think the difference here is if you're an accomplished musician, then the actual like manipulation of the strings is pretty much second nature to you, like muscle memory, and you're much more concerned with things like timing and tone and creating a particular vibe in the room. But if you're a novice who still has to focus on like actually playing the correct notes, then you're way more focused on controlling your fingers, which is dexterity. So if I was playing the piano, that would be a dex check because I am an idiot. But if Marty was playing the piano, it would be a charisma check because Marty has actual talent. In both situations, we have the same goal, perform. So we would use the same skill, performance, but we are using different means. Like for me, it's not fucking up the fingering, so it's dex. And for Marty, it's creating a mood conducive to enjoying the piece, so that's charisma. That's just an example of how context always informs what a check, quote unquote, should be. There's not one way to perform any more than there's one way to intimidate. So, constitution is your ability to keep your body the same. If that sounds crazy, that's because it is crazy, and I've spent too long thinking about constitution. It's a weird definition, but it is actually how the game treats constitution. There aren't any skills associated with constitution because you don't actually have to do anything actively to keep your body the same. Thank God. Can you imagine how bad this game would be if you were constantly trying to keep your limbs on or something? Side note, it would rule. Anyway, the closest we get to a constitution skill is concentration, which is a constitution save that you have to make when you are casting certain spells and you take damage. It's like your ability to maintain focus on a spell. We will totally get to this when we cover spell casting in a little bit, but for now, just know constitution has something to do with concentration. Thank God, because they both start with con. Intelligence. Intelligence covers your academic knowledge and your reasoning abilities. So, intelligence is the first ability we've come across that has a ton of skills. It has investigation, history, arcana, religion. I already said history, nature. It's got a bunch of skills, and these skills are really interesting things that help players know more about their world. Intelligence in real life is one of the coolest and most valuable abilities you can have. The hardest part of making intelligence feel cool in Dungeons & Dragons is that we basically want all skills and checks to happen during the determine step of describe, decide, determine. But intelligence skills pretty much all precede decisions. Like, you want to know what you know so you can make a decision about it. My solution moving forward, which I just thought of after reading this chapter a billion times, is I'm going to start making these checks passive. I'm going to start making, do I know about arcana? Do I know about religion or history? A passive thing. Because I think you basically either know something or you don't. It's kind of nuts to me, the idea that somebody with +5 arcana could roll a 1 and be like, yeah, I guess I just don't know magic today. Like, that's kind of wild. I think it's much more realistic to say somebody has either studied something or they haven't. It's more fun narratively to say someone has studied something or they haven't, rather than thinking maybe they'll know it soon, who knows? And basically treating it like they're always taking a 10. Now, the difficulty classes that I outlined for consistent DCs, like 10, 15, 20, those don't really make sense for passive skills because you know that players are always going to roll a 10. So you can't say a 20 is hard when a 20 is probably straight up impossible for them. So my suggested tiers are going to be a little different for intelligence checks. I'd say a 10 is common knowledge. Everyone should just know it basically, as long as they have any knowledge of the subject. A 12 is an amateur, like somebody who's dabbled in it would know it if they've put a little time into it. A 15 would be something that any professional would know, but only a professional would know, like tricks of the trade. And 17 or above would be expert level, like you would know everything about this subject. You should get all the information that the dungeon master has about it. The big benefit to me about this is that then when a player is leveling up their character, when they look at skills that they could take proficiencies in, they won't look at religion and history and think, I don't know what I'd do with that. If you say, hey, what's your religion? Oh, it's +2? Okay, then you know a little bit. But if you knew 15, you'd know a lot more. Then if you say that even once or twice as a DM, I bet your players will lose their minds to get the 15 in religion. So the next time they walk into a church, they know everything about it. And then you can even drop that they need a 17. Man, now I want it more than I want intimidation, which for some reason every character is picking. Wisdom. Wisdom is your ability to accept the present for what it is. Hi, I'm Steven, and welcome to my Zen meditation class. Just kidding, this is still the D&D podcast, but we have to talk about what wisdom is, and that's what I think it is. Wisdom is your ability to accept the present for what it is. What the heck does that have to do with rolling dice and being a frickin' superhero, my dude? There are a lot of things that will come up where what's important is sort of putting yourself aside and getting into somebody else's shoes, or putting yourself aside and getting into nobody else's shoes. These are things like getting into a flow, or the sort of martial arts concept of mind, no mind. One weird skill in wisdom is animal handling, and I gotta be honest, I was really wrestling with how animal handling was a wisdom skill, and then I was, totally zoning out and playing games with a friend of mine, and they were talking about how they loved doing martial arts as a kid, but now the only time they use their martial arts training is when they're trying to catch their cat to go to the vet. And I was like, what are you talking about? And they were like, well, cats, they can move faster than you, so you need to clear your mind so that you can just be with the cat and then move faster than it because you're not thinking. And it was just a revelation. So that, I think, is what animal handling is about, is sort of just like that calm state that you can get into with animals when you are just vibing with them. I love that. Finally, let's talk about medicine. Medicine is the wisdom skill that people have the most beef with, and it comes up a lot. I want to clarify that medicine in game terms has one real ability. And the real ability is you can stabilize someone who is dying, which means you can keep them, if somebody's making death saves and you make a successful medicine check on them, then you can keep them from having to make more death saves. A lot of people treat this like it's being house or like being on ER. It's straight up not. It's essentially being the person on a battlefield who goes over to someone when they're freaking out and going into shock and says, hey, breathe. Put pressure on this. This is first aid. It is wisdom because that type of medicine is being the person who's in the present who's saying, hey, you're going to make things worse if you keep freaking out, so I need you to not freak out. That has nothing to do with your intelligence. Now, even these rules bring up diagnosis. Diagnosis is so clearly not about wisdom. Diagnosis is about academic knowledge. It's about being able to look at something and think about what you've done before. This is another perfect example of a variant skill where you should totally feel free to diagnose with intelligence medicine instead of wisdom medicine. So you would use your intelligence modifier and you would use your proficiency if you're proficient in medicine to try to diagnose somebody. And again, I would do that as sort of a passive check because unless you're actively looking for a diagnosis in a big library, you're probably just trying to remember and reason through what you think is wrong with your teammate. So finally, we get to charisma. Now, charisma is a really naughty concept. And before we dive into it mechanically, where it's got a lot going on, I want to talk for a second about basically like my experience being a role player for my entire life. There were huge sections of my life where I would tell people that charisma was, and this is basically a quote, how hot your character was, how attractive they are. And I want to address that for a second because it's really pervasive and it's really easy to say. but it is 100% not true. And what you're saying when you say that charisma is how attractive a character is that the only thing that socially matters is how hot someone is. And at least for me, when I was saying that a lot, what I was really doing is telling people how bitter I was that I didn't think I was attractive enough to merit more social weight. And usually it comes out of a deep insecurity about how attractive you think you are. So I want to say, if you're somebody who finds yourself saying this a lot, you can be the attractive person that you want to be. And while you're on your way to becoming that attractive person, I want to put your mind at rest. Most social things have nothing to do with how hot you are. The majority of social interactions are about how kind you are, how good you are at listening to somebody else, how much you put their needs first, and it's just about a million other things besides how you look to them. So, I don't want to go off on this for too long. I just want to say, if you're one of those people, I'm sorry, I've been there, but it is not true, and you are in control of making it not true for yourself. Whew. Anyway, charisma, what is it if it's not being attractive? Charisma is your ability to exert social pressure to get what you want. Charisma is your ability to exert social pressure to get what you want. That is not as rosy as what we think of when we think of charisma. Because being charismatic is a good thing, we often think that the higher your charisma score, the more charming or good you are as a person. And I really want to challenge that idea. That's not totally true. The annoying, whiny person who constantly badgers people and gets what they want could have just as high of a charisma score as the smooth-talking charlatan that charms their way in the door. I mean, exerting social pressure to get what you want can be basically a passive thing. Like, if you listen to the podcast, Bug actually has a really high charisma score, but you pretty rarely see Bug make a charisma roll, because Bug, the character, is charismatic in that when people meet Bug, I make them want to help Bug. Now, Hugh has a totally different style of charisma. Hugh's very charismatic, but in a very flashy, sort of self-obsessed way. Because she is talented and she wants to show people she's talented. And sometimes that rubs people the wrong way, but Hugh usually gets what she wants too in charismatic situations. These people are both very charismatic, one of them very passively, one of them very actively, one of them very charmingly, one of them differently charmingly. Sorry, Hugh, I know you're listening to this. Now, anyway, deception and persuasion, those kind of like make sense on their face. Performance is also exerting social pressure to get what you want, but in a very different way. Usually a performance skill is like, if you perform very well, then you will move the audience. And when we say you've moved them, you've exerted a force on them. You've changed their position socially. And they're probably a little bit more lenient with you. They're probably a little bit more likely to enjoy your company. That's all it really is. Now, I already talked about intimidation in the strength example, but an example of charisma intimidation might be sort of politely embarrassing someone into doing something for you. Let's say you were visiting a king who was getting old and you wanted to do something, but the king didn't want you to do it. Then you might at dinner bring up the topic that you wanted to do and then say, oh, well, if you're not feeling up to it, Your Majesty, I know you've been very sick lately. I would hate to endanger your health more. Now they're in a weird social situation where they have to sort of say yes to your request. This is basically charisma intimidation. You have basically scared them socially into doing what you want. And that wraps up the talking about abilities. Wow, well, the rules section is over. And remember last episode when we met the lore bard? Well, I regret to inform you that I've invited a visiting professor to talk to us now. A professor that I call Professor Cool Math. Take it away, Professor Cool Math. All right, man. Catch you later. Sorry, just had to wrap up a quick jewel sesh with my bro, Ninja. But now, I want to hang with you. You should get to know me a little. My name's Professor Cool Math. That's right, my parents' surname was Math. They named me Cool at birth, and then I spent my life in pursuit of mathematics while also becoming rad to the max. Now I have 6 PhDs, all of them lit as fuck. Here's what's up with me. I want to talk to you about the probabilities of advantage and disadvantage in D&D 5th edition. Whoa! Why are you looking so bummed? Is that a word that cool people use? I don't think so, but we're just gonna keep going with it. I won't go over the whole math of having a different curve because you're rolling 2 dice. I'll just tell you what you need to know. You gotta know your odds of success with a DC 10, a DC 15, and a DC 20 when you have advantage and disadvantage. So I'm gonna give you that and get the heck out, because this episode's already pretty dang long. Anyway, let's do it with advantage first. If you're rolling with advantage and you want to beat a DC 10, then you have an 80% chance of success. That's like 25% higher than usual, because remember, you win on a tie. Anyway, DC 15 with advantage? That's right, it's 51%. That's before modifiers. You're basically 50-50 right there. And if you want to beat a DC 20, usually you're looking at a 5% chance, but with advantage, that's a 10% chance. That's pretty cool. Now let's talk about disadvantage. Disadvantage sucks. If you're looking to beat a DC 10 with disadvantage, you only have a 30% chance of success. DC 15, you only have a 9% chance of success. And a DC 20, you better kiss your butt goodbye, because that's a 0.3% chance of success. So if you're a player, try not to get disadvantage. And if you're a DM, please know what you're doing when you give disadvantage. That's hard as heck. Anyway, I gotta go practice my kickflips and Google what cool is at this point, because clearly I'm wildly out of touch. See ya! I'm so sorry about that. One nice thing about having a podcast to yourself is that when a character stumbles in and you don't like them, you can kill that character forever. Sadly, I love Professor Cool Math, and he will return to us whenever we have to talk about math, because I'm a heinous monster, and I think it's very great that he's around. Anyway, this was a super packed episode. It's only 5 pages of reading, but there's a lot of content to it, and using ability scores is a big part of Dungeons & Dragons. Even though we talked a lot about each ability score this time and some thoughts about how to set DCs, these concepts are all throughout the books, and we will touch on them again and again and again. If you take anything away from this episode, then let it be one of these 2 things. 1, you can use different abilities with different skills based on the context of the action that you're taking. If you are using a strength check to intimidate someone, that can be a strength intimidation check. If you're using intelligence to diagnose someone, that can be an intelligence medicine check. Try to be flexible with these things. And if you're a player, respect whatever your DM decides. It's more important to have agreement at the table than to be technically correct. If you take anything away from this as a DM, then I really hope that it's consistent DCs. You don't have to use the guidelines I laid out at the beginning, but find a way to communicate to your players that success isn't something arbitrary that you're making up. It's a real concept that they can strive towards and that they will get better at over time. It's one of the most fun parts of Dungeons & Dragons, and I really hope that you embrace it at your table. As always, I would love it if you kept reading, but that's all we're reading for this episode. So if you want to read more, can I recommend, what will I recommend? The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers is a really fun sci-fi book. I super love it. I would definitely check it out if you like the podcast. It will be right up your alley. Thank you so much for listening. As always, please like and follow us and review us. It really super helps out, especially right now while everyone's sitting at home. You can find us on Twitter at secondbestu. You can email us your questions at secondbestdnd@gmail.com. Just put SBU in the subject line so I know what it's about. And thank you so much. I'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye. Second Best You is created by Stephen Buckley and is produced by Stephen Buckley and Marty Scanlon. All music is by Marty Scanlon. Second Best is produced by Stephen Kelly and Marty Scanlon. You can follow us on Twitter at SecondBestU or SecondBestDND. And you can check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/secondbestdnd. Thanks!